De Beers is obviously a mining company. We mine diamonds, primarily focused in southern Africa. We are owned by Anglo American, so we're effectively a business unit of Anglo American. That's an indication of where we operate globally. Obviously, there from a De Beers perspective, we have a sort of a retail outlet component in terms of our product. And so there are a number of jewelry stores, so we, right throughout that. So that map is probably not as representative in terms of where our footprint is. A variety of minerals that Anglo American mines, and obviously at the bottom there, I'm going to speak about a De Beers approach in terms of our management of biodiversity. An extensive company, 150,000 employees, although I think given the sort of global and current economic outlook, that figure is changing as Anglo is busy divesting in quite a number of operations. So sadly that figure is going to come down, and I think that's just indicative of the global economy right now. So in terms of Anglo American, an interesting structure around De Beers. So De Beers, it's 85% owned by Anglo American and the other 15% owned by the government of Botswana, and that together makes up the De Beers family of companies. Just in terms of a bit of local relevance, Anglo has a prospecting project up in Finland, northern Finland, just north of Sodankla, Sakati. That just gives it a bit of a local flavour. So how has, and I think just, really the point of today's talk is to try and pick up a little bit about what Tom was saying, is to say, there are so many commitments, there's so many recommendations. You've got, the Sustainable Development Goals, you've got recommendations coming out of the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment. So what I'm going to try and do is just bring, after each sort of slide, I'll try and see where it links to some of those recommendations of the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment. Admittedly, De Beers, it doesn't have an operation in Finland. We do, as I'll show you a bit later, some of our operations in Canada are probably right on the edge of the Arctic Circle, and so a lot of these initiatives are very relevant to us. We've heard a lot, the previous speakers talk about the mitigation hierarchy, so I'm not going to go into too much detail around it. Effectively, how we approach it right from the early days of avoidance, right through to the mitigation, and then ultimately you don't want to get to offsets. And I think that's one of the key things that we've looked at it from a De Beers perspective, just to say, you should be thinking about not having to get to that point of offsets if you apply the mitigation hierarchy correctly. What we also did is probably, and it was interesting that it was mentioned this morning around the approach, and I didn't quite get the sort of final answer about the no net loss approach from Finland. But we, as De Beers, put our heads probably above the parapet a bit, and we made a commitment to aiming to achieve no net loss of significant biodiversity. And I think it was really, it's an aspirational commitment. It was very difficult for us. We, at the time, companies like Rio Tinto were probably the forerunners in terms of having a net positive impact commitment, and so we did it. And I think what the bottom line is that it drives the right behaviour within the company, and it forces you to not just be compliant, but it forces you to be proactive in terms of how you approach biodiversity. One of the other key components, and that's our environmental policy on the right there, is making a significant contribution in the areas in which we operate. Ernest Oppenheimer, at the time when he was then current chairman of Anglo American and De Beers, made a statement which, if you took it out of the sort of sustainability talk of today, is very relevant to today. And he said, we mine minerals and we mine, yes, to make a profit, but to do so in such a way that we can make a lasting contribution in the areas into the areas that we operate and the people in those areas. And I think that really has sort of set the cornerstone around De Beers' environmental commitment, and as I said, going back 120 years of De Beers' mining history. We also got a statement and a key outcome in our policy is to not operate within World Heritage Site core areas, as well as respecting key biodiversity and protected areas. And it's in line with the ICMM commitments, as well as the Responsible Jewellery Council, have those very, very key commitments. So that really, Tom, is in terms of how we're addressing some of those key recommendations, and then it's an idea of where we are mainstreaming biodiversity right through to from our policy commitments through to our biodiversity standards, through to our biodiversity guidelines, all part of how we operate. So I think just in terms of how How do you understand some of those biodiversity risks, and more importantly, where we see opportunities? And it's interesting, De Beers as a mining company is probably one of the only companies that is so closely linked to the product that we mine. If you're mining platinum, what your end product, you never really get to see it. Whereas for De Beers, we are so closely linked to the product. The diamond that we mine at the operation is the product that we sell, when you walk out the jewelry store with a diamond ring on your finger. And so reputation for us is an absolute key market driver. If there's something that's going to influence our reputation as a mining company, that obviously has a huge impact. So it's very important that we bring in that environmental performance, and in terms of how we communicate that to our stakeholders. So it probably does set us apart from other mining companies that, as I said, that we are so closely linked to our product. What it also gives us an opportunity to do is to look at where there are risks and opportunities, and I think that's obviously key. And it just, as I said earlier, drives that sort of continual improvement in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis. That's a picture of an operation that we have in northern Canada, Gachakwe, which is just in project stage. So again, how are we doing it? We bring it at making sure that we are resilient, making sure that we have the right approach to that, with an approach around climate change. Water is obviously a key risk for us, and it's probably not as significant here in the European sort of areas, but certainly in Southern Africa, water is a key driver in terms of our business risk, and so that adaptation to climate change there is critical. What's also, I think, important and what sets us aside is looking at opportunities. We want to ensure that some of these outcomes deliver best practice. We actively engage on the business and biodiversity front to a point where in South Africa we are part and sort of founding partners of the South African Mining and Biodiversity Forum, which brings together companies, mining companies, extractives, the Department of Minerals, our Department of Environment, so government agencies, NGOs, academics, all together. And one of the very good outcomes that we've produced is a guideline, and I know some of the requirements, but there's too many guidelines, but there was definitely a niche for this. And so we produced the South African Mining and Biodiversity Guideline, which is available on our Chamber of Mines website, giving very clear steps and opportunities that businesses can look at to see where can they mainstream biodiversity. What it also gives us an opportunity, and we have a very close collaboration with research and academic institutions. And this is a project that's running up at Victor Mine in Northern Ontario in Canada, looking at the impact of the caribou herds in and around our mining operations. So we've actively engaged with universities, we actively engage with the researchers, and what we want is to share that information. I think it was a point also raised yesterday at the session around holding on to this information. And there's no point in reinventing the wheel. If the baselining and the work that you're doing there is getting done, by all means share it. And that's part of our sort of mandate, is to make sure that we share this information that we do get. And so that really looking at some of those individual stresses around your area operation. What are the potential impacts that you're going to have, and what can you do to actively engage with that? And again, a key step around mainstreaming biodiversity. So one of the things that we did is to say we've made this no net loss commitment. Well, how do we actually monitor it? How do you achieve it? So we set up a biodiversity value assessment, which really just looks at a methodology approach around how we assess biodiversity from a value perspective. It's been reviewed by Fauna and Flora International, and it's in-house. There's nothing out there. There was nothing off the shelf that we could take to say, what works in South Africa, what's going to work in northern Canada, what's going to work off the west coast of South Africa, and what works in our marine environment. So admittedly, it is quite broad, but it does give us a clear indication around what are some of the biodiversity commitments and impacts around some of these operations. So it's underpinned by IFC Performance Standard 6. It's obviously, we've done a retrospective look at some of our operations. I mean, if you go back to Kimberley, we're not going to turn the clock back 120 years and say, well, we shouldn't have been mining there. But the retrospective assessments have been done. Again, an attempt to address how we incorporate resilience as well as some adaptation. So just a couple of key highlights from a Canadian operation. We've got two mines and one project. Victor and Snap Lake are mines at the moment. Gachakwe is a project which is in construction phase. And within it, there's a number of stresses in terms of things that what we're looking at. habitat restoration around a stream diversion that we did at Victor, the impact of, as I said, mentioned caribou and then bank and barn swallows. The commitment there is that after mining, 5 years after mining, there must be no visible sign of the mine. So that's quite an important commitment that's been made, and obviously we're going to stick to that. In Snap Lake, we've got a lot of work that's been done around some of our water monitoring and also looking at the impact of barren ground grizzly bears. In Gachukwe, a very interesting project around the construction. It's under a lake. And there's a very interesting project around actually closing off the lake, building a series of dikes, draining the lake, mining the kimberlite pipes, and then reflooding the lake. And together with the neighboring community, have agreed that there's a fish out program. So they've actually been part of the program where they're removing the fish, and then are going to be part of the restocking exercise after that. So a very close collaboration with the local community there. Again, bringing in some of those ecosystem-based management options and looking at some individual stresses. So really just to sort of close off on the last two slides is an initiative which we've called the Diamond Route. If you Google the Diamond Route, you'll come up with a site. What it does, and this again I think just highlights the opportunity that mining companies probably quite miss. De Beers owns, in some instances, owns land. So we own over 180,000 hectares of conservation land that link diamonds to mining. It looks at a whole range of endangered species. We all know about the plight of our rhino population in South Africa. And so we're making significant contribution towards that in Botswana. The conservation area around our mine is actually now the single biggest protector of white rhino population in the country of Botswana, and that's happened within 2 years. But it's because of utilizing those land holdings from an operation point of view. So again, what it does is just help in terms of our knowledge and public awareness, as well as looking for these key areas that we are there because as a result of the mine being there, we have this opportunity to link them in terms of key biodiversity areas. There was a bit of talk about World Heritage Sites. Obviously, significance is a mining operation we have in northern South Africa, which actually is on the boundary of the Mapungubwe World Heritage Site, and we work very closely with that. Supporting biodiversity stewardship opportunities. The rest is quite South Africa specific, where we have very close lease agreements with our National Parks Authority. The land is actually owned by De Beers, and we've entered into lease agreements with the National Parks Authority to give them the land over a 99-year lease period. So you go into a national park, the land's actually owned by a mining company, but it's a conservation area, which I think is quite unique. Certainly unique in the mining industry, and probably unique even within business. Again, looking at important and identifying safe areas for that. So I think the last slide is just really an idea around how do we seize on these opportunities. So mining companies have extensive areas under their license. It's not land owned, it's mining license areas. So over 1 million hectares, that graph on the right. The actual footprint that we impact on is 27,000 hectares, and the area that we actively manage for pure conservation, about 180,000 hectares. So a fantastic opportunity to say, how do you influence and how do you use some of these key areas that you have influence over from a management point of view to turn them. And then on the left, as I said, some of those 2 formal protected areas is in South Africa, our national parks, under a lease agreement, and looking at 40,000 hectares of land there. So really just an example of how working together with the mining company, using that collaborative work and the opportunities to say if there are particular areas of biodiversity significance, be it Natura 2000 sites, there is an opportunity to collaborate and get in with your NGOs and with your government over securing those protected areas. And I think that's the end of it. Thank you very much.
Do we have questions on the floor right away for Warwick? Thanks for energizing us a bit.
No diamonds yet, maybe.
We have a question in the back. You have the floor as soon as the microphone will get all the way there.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. My name is Jari Luukkonen. I'm working here in WWF Finland. You raised this one point from Finland, Sakatti, and of course I have to ask you now because we are in the seminar of biodiversity and business, and you also mentioned these guidelines that you respect these legally designed protected areas. And in Sakatti, actually, the proposed mine area is in the middle of one of the Natura 2000 sites, a Meyer-Aapa called Viiankiaapa. So it would be very interesting to hear from you, what concrete plans do you have to combine this biodiversity and business in that site? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, so an interesting similarity is an operation that we've had in South Africa. Venetia mine is South Africa's biggest diamond mine. It was discovered in the 1980s at a time where the area was recognized as significant in terms of biodiversity, but there was no formal, there wasn't a national park. So there was a provincial nature reserve, but it didn't have protected area status. The mine was established, we put in extensive infrastructure to gain access to water, and through a period of negotiating at the time with government, is that they actually realized that it was a significant area for biodiversity. And so we worked together with them to say, as long as the infrastructure that was put in by the mine is obviously not going to be impacted on by let's, if they said, well, we want to create a protected area, but you've got to take your infrastructure away. We said, well, the infrastructure is there, let's work together. And that is how so the mine is still carrying on. But actually, when they revised the buffer zone of the World Heritage Site. So it eventually became a national park, and then it was declared a World Heritage Site. And in that declaration, we found ourselves, the mine was actually within the core area of the national park and of the World Heritage Site. And, I mean, and I guess it was an opportunity to say, there's a mineral resource there. It's not, the footprint of the mine is not going to expand. And rather work together with a company, a responsible company, that has got a commitment to say, we're going to address closure operations. We've got long-term commitment in terms of the area. Then sort of having a blanket approach to say, either move your mining operation away or stop mining. And so I think, for Sakatti, I've got my colleague here who's actually the environmental lead of the project, can certainly answer a little bit more directly. But I think it's finding that balance between a responsible mining company, the resource is there, and is the reality that the resource is ultimately going to be exploited at a stage? And do you then say, well, let's work with a company like Anglo American, who've got a long-term responsible approach to it, to say, how can we best match the two together? I mean, I think, if there was a yes-no answer, it would be very difficult. And I think there are commitments, certainly in certain areas where there are areas of high biodiversity, which should be no-go areas. But there are also those other grey areas that perhaps, with a little bit of clever collaboration with a responsible company, that you can actually have both. And so a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think there's an opportunity to work together rather than have it as a no-go, because ultimately that resource is always going to be there. It's one of the risks that we face, is to say, and our legislation in South Africa is such that the protected area legislation can change, and so if there's a valuable enough resource, the minister can actually repeal that to say, it's no longer a protected area and you can now mine it. But rather have it mined by a responsible company. I think that's the short answer.